Hi, and welcome to the OrgDev podcast. So, how do you shape and develop the ultimate team, the team of teams? Yesterday, we're looking at organization design. The aim of organization design is to shape group behavior, but how do you do it in a way that helps build healthy organizations and ultimately a society that works for all? So, with that in mind, we're absolutely delighted to introduce and invite today Julian Chender, who's joining us from New York today. Julian is principal for the global consulting firm Accenture. So Julian has been in the field of OD since 2013, and he's passionate about creating ways which people can learn about and advance in the field of OD. So in 2020, Julian joined Kessler, part of Accenture, as an organization design fellow, and recently transferred to Accenture's thought leadership and expert track as principal. Prior to his time at Kessler and Accenture, he was in consultancy roles at Veldhoven and the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases as well. So outside of work, Julian's a real driver and is always looking to create better work and improve standards in the OD profession. So he's been an advisory board member and liaison to the board director of Organization Design Forum. He's a guest lecturer at various universities, including Cornell, and he's also founder of the OD Salon and also Coffee and Cocktails as well. So we're absolutely delighted to have Julian join us today. Danny and I have been looking forward to this call all week long, haven't we, Danny?
Absolutely, yeah. It's going to be the highlight of the week for us.
So thank you so much for joining us, Julian.
Absolutely a pleasure. I think I've been looking forward to this for a few months now.
Brilliant. It's lovely to have you with us. So just to kick us off, just tell us a bit about your work. What does it involve?
So a lot of my work is led by the C-suite. And that could be a C-suite of foundation, of a nonprofit, which is where I spend most of my time. It could be a public sector organization, state or federal government, which is also a place to spend most of my time, or a Fortune 10 where I've worked in the past. And that work is about top-down planned organizational change. So we're going back to Dick Beckhardt's, it's 1960s definition of organization development. It's diagnostic, it's led with diagnosis, and it's developing the organization from the point of view of Galbraith's STAR model. So it's thinking about how do we align structure, processes and governance, metrics and rewards, and talent practices to the organization's strategy. So to sum it up, what I say is I do strategy-led organization design.
So it's organization design rather than organization development, or how do you differentiate between the two?
That is a question that I'm still wrestling with.
Yep.
I would say organization development says organization design is one of the things we do in organization development. And organization design would say we're a distinct field that uses a lot from organization development. I don't really care which one it is, as long as your practice is informed by both, because I think that's where this work shines. So I would say where I work is in organization design from the point of view of it's a design methodology. It's a design framework. It's specifically my time is spent in organization design forums and communities. But all of my work is informed by years and years of training in the organization development space. And so the methodology that I work with, the Kessler methodology, is based on work by the Axelrods and conference model, and based on Future Search, Marv and Sandra. And so it's really about bringing large groups together to co-create the future. So it's diagnostic up front, dialogic throughout, and really, really messy in the right places if you could do it right.
Sounds fascinating. And just to sort of help people that are just getting introduction to this, if I was an organization, how would I know that I would need to engage an organization like you? What might be some of the symptoms or needs that might be sort of driving that?
Usually it's people come to organization design from a question of structure most of the time. They say our structure is wrong. And I say, maybe, but that's only part of organization design. And they say, well, we want to fix the structure. I say, okay, we can do that. And we would have to do X, Y, and Z, et cetera. Because if you just fix the structure, you don't have any way of working across the structure. You have no way of activating the structure. You have no way of understanding what that structure is supposed to accomplish. So one of my mentors says that looking at an org chart, you immediately lose about 150 IQ points. It's really, really, really a place to go to forget everything you know about how organizations work. So we do org design with very little org chart work. It's involved, it's necessary to get to the end result, but there's a whole lot up front that's about how do we translate the strategy into how we organize ourselves intellectually and I think another mentor of mine, Amy Kate, says we create invisible edifices. So when we build the organization chart is something you can see. And so people go right to that. They're like, I understand that this person reports to this person reports to this person. And that makes me feel secure because I get how that works. And we say, well, most of org design is stuff you can't see and you can't touch. And so it's really the invisible organization. It's the whole of it. It's the gestalt that we design. And then to answer your other question about org development is about living in that on the day-to-day. So there is sometimes in org design and org development a bit of a handoff where the designers will work up front to create structure, visible and invisible, to create the processes, visible and invisible, design the metrics and set the talent strategy. And org developers will go and work with the teams to actually figure out how that's lived on a day-to-day basis. And I would say my work crosses that boundary, and the more it crosses that boundary, the better my work ends up being.
That's fascinating. And we'll ask you some questions about how you came to be where you are, because I think that's just such an interesting question. You said at the beginning that you do like a sort of a diagnostic, so to sort of understand and appreciate what is. What kind of steps would you take a client through with that in terms of to understand?
It's very, very old school. It's serious interviews and document review. So if we're doing an enterprise of 6,000 people, we would interview, a cross section of 35. Maybe 40 if we have a lot of space and time. And those would be about 45 minutes. And there'd be questions based on Galbraith's STAR model. So we'd ask about strategy, we'd ask about capabilities, we'd ask about structure, process, metrics, how they the talent, how they live, what's working well, what's not working well. And we would collate that. But it's not just about feeding back the data. It's not just saying, here's what we see, we're a mirror. There's insight. That's how we drive into the design, is what do we as designers understand about their organization that they might not understand? What can we offer on top of feeding back what they may or may not see of themselves? How do we digest that for them? And then that's what gets into the design. So from there, we say, okay, do we need to start aligning on strategy? Usually we're hired after a strategy is complete. We're not strategists, we're designers. And the design, the operating model, is the gap between strategy and results, or strategy and implementation, or intention and impact, whatever you want to say. And so the operating model is all that goes into creating the organization that's going and how it's going to run. And so the diagnostic is about what do we need to do better than our competitors or best in our field to really differentiate ourselves and make that difference so that our organization stands out.
If you look at some of the work, like, is it Richard Rummelt, where he talks about strategy, and often what it doesn't do is it doesn't look at really what are the real challenges we're facing. So we have these strategies which are, they're wonderfully elegant documents, but sometimes they're not always correlated with reality or our true capability. So if you're picking things up at the strategy phase, are there often gaps between where the strategy wishes it to be and where the organization is right now? And is there a lot of work to try and bridge that gap?
I mean, that's the foundation of the work, is to bridge that gap. So I would say that's absolutely true. Strategy is very future focused. It's where do we want to be in 5 years? And then there's where are we now? And how do we get to that 5-year mark? That's where I come in. And that's where the operating model work comes in. I think the best is when the organization design and operating model work is done based on current problems to solve. That we're not just doing an operating model to achieve the strategy, but to solve the problems right now that are preventing you from achieving that strategy. Even if that strategy was built yesterday, there's something that's not there. Even if it was built 2 years ago and you're not achieving it, we have even more questions. So what is the problem to solve is so important. I think so much of my life right now is about asking the right questions. So I don't want to solve a problem without knowing what the problem is I'm solving. And it's a disservice to the client to design a wonderful organization that doesn't solve their problems. Now, someone would say, well, that's not an appreciative approach. We want to take their strengths and build on what is. And we do that. That's a huge part of what we do. And that's in what of this organization do we need to preserve and grow? That's part of the diagnostic. Saying what is so special here that we need to actually build into the design that we wouldn't build into a design of company X over here, because they don't have that. So we do highlight the special, and the capabilities are about what do we do well and what do we need to do really well. So there is a positive approach, but to ignore the problems to solve would be a disservice to the client, because then you're designing something that doesn't actually fix the problems that are in implementing strategy. And that's what we're here to do.
Just for people who might be watching this and they're just starting to get introduced to things like the operating model. So we're not looking for an Oxford Collins dictionary definition of it, but what is like an operating model to you guys? Like, what does it contain?
The fun part about the operating model is that there's a lot of conversation about what is an operating model, and there's no answer. So
everyone watching this just gone, okay.
everyone has a different definition of the operating model. And in fact, it's a competitive differentiator among consulting companies to have different versions of an operating model that they prescribe to clients. So Accenture has theirs, Deloitte has theirs, BCG has theirs. So in this big space, we're all competing on our operating model is the right one. And the answer is they're all cuts of the same pie, which is what are the things that go from strategy to results? And the way Accenture developed its operating model and organization design practice was through the acquisition of Kessler. And Kessler was the hereditary result of the STAR model from Jay Galbraith. Jay had the STAR model. He said, I want to write a book. He said, Amy Cates, Diane Downey, I'm working with you. Do you want to write the book with me? Then Diane passed away. He wanted to write a second book. Amy wrote the second book with Jay. Then Amy met Greg Kessler, and they are now the holders of the STAR model. And the STAR model is not theirs, but they are the ones who've given it the most thought. And so that's my now lineage, is the STAR model. And so for me, design is about the STAR model, and therefore the operating model is about how do you get all those points of the STAR to align? What are the things you need? And some people talk about workspace, and some people talk about teams and networks, and they're all relevant depending on the client. So I would say writ large, to kind of round this out and maybe have a clear definition, the operating model is anything that takes you from strategy to results. My basis for that is the STAR model.
So that could be people, process, systems, and anything in between as well.
Right.
A question we'd really like to ask is, so what was your journey into the field of OD? Did it find you? Did it something you come across? Like, so what was your sort of your journey, and how did you come to be where you are today?
It found me, and I was looking for it at the same time. So I had the good fortune of graduating with a liberal arts degree in 2009 during the financial crisis, where my marketable skills were reading and writing, occasionally research. So I was not ready for a job. And I thought, I really want to help people. And so I'm going to go to social work school. And I lasted about 6 weeks. I thought I would be a therapist. And I realized within the 6 weeks that I was far too young, far too immature, and far too scared to be a therapist. So I thought, well, I have to figure out another way to help people, and needed work. So I found a job tutoring for the SAT and ACT, which are our college entrance exams here in the States. And thought, this is really interesting because I'm not teaching trigonometry for more than 10 minutes of the hour. I'm doing a lot of helping the student figure out how to feel successful and feel confident, and manage the fact that her parents want her to go to one school, but she wants to go to another because she's actually interested in something that they're not interested in her being interested in. And then how do we pay for it? Well, then that has to factor in. So I'm dealing with individuals, family systems, and the education system. And I thought, I really like systems. I didn't have a word for it. I didn't have the word systems, but that was really interesting to me. And then I had kind of a moment where I realized seeing 17-year-olds and their parents for my entire career was probably not the longevity that I wanted out of life. So wanted to get out of New York, moved to Washington, D.C., took a job in the federal government doing Freedom of Information Act requests. So really a government paper pusher for 3 years. And that's where I kind of thought about what I wanted to do. Ended up going to the Authentic Leadership and Action Institute with my uncle, which was one of the early dialogic OD gatherings in Halifax, Nova Scotia. So encountered presencing, encountered appreciative inquiry, encountered Dharma arts. And I said to him, this is what I want to do. I met Glenda Yang and human systems dynamics there. And I said to him, this is what I want to do. What is this? And he goes, this is called organization development. And I said, never heard of it.
It's a thing. People have jobs to do. There's a career.
Well, turns out not only that, there's a graduate program in the city I live in at American University that's actually quite good. And so I, within a year, ended up in the American University Masters of Science in Organization Development from there, found my way into the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, which was our COVID response place for the US. That's Tony Fauci's organization. And I was there doing enterprise strategy work and team development and individual leadership development. So playing at multiple levels of system for 3.5 years during Ebola and Zika. And we talked about the culture of this institute versus other institutes within the National Institutes of Health. And they said, look, infectious disease is fast. Cancer is slow. Like cancer research isn't going to change overnight. But when we have an Ebola outbreak, we're getting on a plane and we're flying to Liberia or Sierra Leone. And I thought that changes how we have to develop leaders here. That changes how we have to structure our organization. That changes how we have to develop people. That changes how we have to set our strategy. And so from there, I really understood that the unique capabilities of an organization are based on what they're supposed to be doing. Love took me back to New York, found a job with Feldhun and Company, which was my first external consulting experience. Did a lot of work on workplace strategy. So the intersection of tech, culture, and physical space. Spent a lot of time in pharma in New Jersey. And then thought, I'm designing physical spaces with culture in mind. So what is the actual organization that goes with this physical space? And I thought, I remember I had one class in graduate school where I learned about the STAR model for about 2 hours. And that class, I wrote my paper on the STAR model. And it just came to me as like, that's what I want to be doing. And so I found Amy Cates, also living in New York, the inheritor of the STAR model. And I asked her for coffee. And I think I bought her a cup of coffee and a croissant. And it was the best return on investment I've ever had.
Amazing. And what was your sort of introduction into Kessler? Because it's got a particular kind of approach, a perspective, like a methodology. Like, what was your kind of sort of entrance into the organization, into the world OD&D consulting?
Amy was very generous. So we really hit it off that morning, and she invited me to her public class at Cornell, which was happening in, I think, 6 weeks. And I was all ready to go, sit in a room with 20 org designers and learn her methodology, and then COVID hit. So it was immediately online. And what that did was it gave me time, because it was spaced out instead of 2 days, it gave me time to actually really settle it and play with the material. And I must have asked enough good questions for her to think I had something to offer, because she had me work with one of her colleagues in a tutoring capacity for about 6 more months. So we weren't working together. I was still working at Feldhun, and she hadn't been acquired yet by Accenture. There was a mutual courting where she was teaching her methodology, I was digesting it, and I was interested. And then as soon as she got acquired, she was able to hire me, and sort of after a short period into Accenture. So my org design career has been with Kessler, but the Accenture version of Kessler.
Yeah, and Accenture's helped Kessler kind of grow quite explosively, hasn't it? It's gone from like a practice of 30, I think last time I heard was around about 100. And I imagine it's got some form of global footprint as well now.
Yeah, so the numbers are actually a bit more stark. It was 10 people who came over with the acquisition, and we're 150 globally. We have three practices: North America, Europe, and growth markets. And we have a Teams chat that's very live with lots of interesting questions across the globe, at all hours.
And you do lots of things around kind of your day job, don't you? You're kind of involved in lots of kind of OD related things. Do you want to tell us a bit more about some of those?
Sure. So I spend a lot of time with the Organization Design Forum, which I really enjoy. So we just had the conference last week, and I host a monthly gathering there called the Coffee to Cocktails Club, which is based on the OD Salon, which I had founded when I moved to New York, and I'll explain that in a second. But the Coffee to Cocktails Club is, what is Julian interested in this month? Can he ask 2 questions about it and form enough people to get together into breakout groups? And the answer continuously seems to be yes, to my great pleasure. And it's more about learning through social learning than it is about any other teaching quality. So there's no lecture. I think the slide I share is the questions that you're supposed to talk about in your groups. And half the groups don't even talk about the questions. So really a social place to network and just share what we're doing. Because I think there's so many people doing this work in so many different pockets that aren't talking to each other as much as we could. And I think that the more we talk to each other, the stronger the field becomes. So what you're doing here is phenomenal for the field. And what you're doing with CIPD is phenomenal for the field. So that for me is that's my version of that. The OD Salon was a bit of an experiment, because in Washington, D.C., there was an American University alumni group, and we would get together for happy hour about once a month. And it was mostly just hanging out with people who understood what you did. There wasn't a lot of talking about work, but just to be with people who understood this bizarre thing we do called org design and development was really a relaxing time and a place of great friendship. And when I moved to New York, I spent about 8 months interviewing for jobs in New York. And I got pretty far in some, got a couple offers, and got turned down by many. My takeaway was that no one knew each other. So the SVP of OD at MasterCard didn't know the SVP of OD at Citibank. And I thought, well, that's a problem. And I like both of you, and I think you'd like each other. So let's have a happy hour. And it started with a happy hour on a snowy March day. I think we had 8 people. And it scaled into monthly gatherings of 120 people in New York. And then in COVID went online. And so we had a wider reach. But as I transitioned more into focusing with the Org Design Forum, I passed it on to Kai Stowers, who's now running the OD Salon. But I kept kind of that gathering community quality in the Org Design Forum Coffee to Cocktails Club. So that's a lot of what I do in terms of convening.
That warms our heart to know that you're building an OD&D community, because it's so true though, isn't it? Because as capable as these people are, it means there's a lot of learning curves that are far steeper than they probably need to be. And we all do it on our own particular way, but just that little bit of know-how and often normalizing it. And I guess everything about being an OD&D person doing it in an organization is you don't really have a space where you're not on stage and you're not being visible. So it is quite good to have time out with your peers, isn't it?
I find it's the nourishment we need to go out there.
One of the things we like to do with this podcast is just demystify kind of the field of OD&D a little bit for the audience, and because it can feel quite mysterious to people.
A typical week is, I usually have one client at a time. That's kind of how I'm structured at Accenture. Right now, I'm working with a nonprofit in California that's about 6,000 people that does extended learning. So before school education, after school education, summer education, anything that the public school system doesn't do. And the weeks vary because of the stages of the project. So in the diagnostic stage, it's very intense because we're talking to people all day, trying to collate the data, trying to gather insights. Then we have a big workshop where we have the high level design, where we say, what are the capabilities that we need to build for? And what is the organization model? So the picture on a page, not boxes and lines in terms of an org chart, but actually the big buckets of work, the strategic grouping. And so we flew out to California, did 3 days with them. And that was that was a week unlike any other. So I would say there isn't a standard week, because now we're doing detailed design where we have a lot of online sessions to do the different departments in a lot more detail, where we're getting into org charts and we're getting into sort of processes. And then there's going to be the change implementation and the activation of that, which will be a lot more sitting in on meetings, helping them figure out how they're going to actually work this system that we've designed. In any week, I have that client work, which has its own stages. I then have writing. So I like to write. Working on a couple things right now and trying to find the time. I think I could use a bit more discipline, to be quite honest, being away at that. I spend a lot of time mentoring and coaching. I quite like that. So I have people inside and outside Accenture who I spend time with, talking about what we do and how we do it, and making sense of challenges that we're facing. And it's quite collaborative. And
your writing is how you came on our radar, actually, because we saw a number of articles that you'd written, and they just kind of sort of struck a chord with us. And we liked how sort of provocative and thought-provoking, and how you were sort of finding meaning in just everyday life to it sort of articulate different points about organization development. Is the writing something that's quite important for you?
It is, because it's my way of making sense of my experience, and it challenges me to articulate what I do. And I think for the longevity of the field and the growth of the field, we need to be able as professionals to say why we do what we do. Otherwise, there's really no way to teach it. So this is an attempt to teach and share the little I'm learning every day. So my ahas are just mine if I sit there and watch television or do something else. But my ahas could be many others if I codify them. And write them. And it's in the process of doing that I actually understand what the aha really means. I think if I have the aha, it feels lovely. But when I write it, it starts to say, did I really understand that properly? Am I really making sense of this? How could I use this? And what do I need to be doing differently? So it's a bit of a self-challenge, which is probably why I also avoid it occasionally.
For people that are watching, we really want people to follow Julian's work. So feel free, in the show notes, there will be a link to able to actually follow Julian's work as well. So you start to touch on things that you actually enjoy. What is it that you enjoy most about your role in OD?
I think it's the idea that we are in a place to ask continuously the right questions and continuously perfect what those right questions are. So I had dinner with a friend last night who's a bassoonist, and we were talking about craft, the craft that we do. And I consider org design and development a craft. I'm a tradesperson with tools that you can't see and results that you can't see, but I'm a tradesperson nonetheless. And I think the continuous perfection of the craft is really, really what lights me up, because the craft is always changing as organizations change, as people change, as society changes. So the craft is never complete. And the story that really stuck with me from dinner last night was my friend, we were talking about the perfection of a craft. And he said that there was a cellist called Pablo Casals who was in his 80s and was not performing anymore, but he was teaching. And someone came to his house to take a lesson and heard him practicing before the lesson, and was very surprised that someone so accomplished and basically retired would be practicing. And the story, as I heard it, was that the student said, "Maestro, I'm so sorry, but why are you practicing such a simple piece?" And Casal said, "Because I think I'm making progress." And that stood out to me as exactly why it's important to focus on the, because it's the pursuit for perfection that is perfection, not getting there, which gives me this great feeling of always learning, which I think is a bit new for me. I think I've always wanted to know, and I've only become halfway decent when I started to want to learn, not want to know. That's when my practice actually changed.
And I think it's making that a shift that you can't know. We're always learning, and you're never going to get there and know and be done, and be the finished article.
Right, which is a little depressing in and of itself, but quite freeing.
Yeah.
How you look at it.
Another question I wanted to ask you. So participation and participative, engagement of people is at the heart of kind of a lot of the OD work that we do. Do you have a preferred tool or process that you love to use to involve and kind of engage people in the work that you do?
I love making my clients do the work, and not just because it means I do less, because I don't. Actually making the clients do the work is an art in and of itself. But I think people own what they help create. People will there's an ownership. And I've seen so many other org designers do this, where they say, okay, I'll do the diagnostic and then I'll come back in a month with a complete org design for you and you'll go implement it. And it never happened, because it's a beautiful slide deck and nothing more. Now, the result I have in 3 times that time is still a beautiful slide deck. And if it stops there, it's nothing more. But the difference is that I didn't create those slides. I might have drawn them, but I didn't create the content. The client created the content. So when we get to implementation, they own that. It's their organization. And it goes back to the fundamental understanding of us as marginal consultants, that we don't know the organization as well as they do. Now, they also don't know organization design and development as well as we do. So we need to come together to create the process and system by which we can come up with a co-created design that we can then stand up and live. And the living we talk about in Kessler's work as practicing. So thinking about this, never really quite perfecting it. You're always practicing the organization. You're always practicing how to live in it. And you're always making slight adjustments as the environment changes, as internal systems change, as regulations change. So it's never complete either. So the idea that I can give you a complete organization design that is then implementable is also a false narrative.
Yeah, it sounds like there's like a big education element of this, or at least a challenging of their mental models, isn't it? Because it's like, okay, the client presents with it's a boxes challenge. You're like, it's not a boxes challenge, it's something else. You guys do the work because we're used to traditional consultancy coming in. Actually, no, you'll be doing the work because you need to have a sense of ownership. And that it's also that it's not just about design, it's about development as well. Like how much effort do you have to put into sort of challenging sort of clients' pre-concepts about what the work is? And sometimes are there clients that just can't seem to get it and then struggle? They may need to work with another organization, for example.
Yes, we have lost bids because people say we don't want to participate. And we say, great, I'm really glad we figured that out
Now, rather than
before you bought the project, because that would be really tough if we were 3 weeks in and you, so why are we here? You should be doing this. That's a very different conversation. So we make very clear in our pitches and our proposals in our bids. And I just did a very big one where we spent most of the time talking about how much time it's going to take from you to do this work and how you really have to want to do it in a way that we think and our experience shows us is going to make the difference. And if you don't want that, that's fine. No harm, no foul, but then we're not the right fit for you. So it's a bit about being the right fit for the client and being very clear up front and in the contracting. And I don't mean contracting just from the document, but I mean the entire process of entry and the discussions and how can we meet your needs to what this really takes. And do they really want to do it? And is it really what they need? Because I think more and more people are asking for design because it's something that's a little easier to understand and buy in their minds than development. And so when I'm very clear in my writing to talk about org design and development as linked. When my clients call me, they're looking for design. They'll get both. There's no way I can do one without the other. But they think they know what they're buying when they're buying design. So there's a whole checking quality of like, well, when I say design, what do you mean? And what do I mean? And how are we actually on the same page or not? If you want to restructure, it's a very different thing than doing a design.
Yeah, it's about getting informed consent, isn't it? Because it's going to take a lot of them. There's a lot of reputational risk, social capital, political capital that's expended, isn't it? It's really important that they understand up front. One thing you mentioned just earlier, because I'm intrigued about one thing. So again, another concept that gets lost, we often get called in after the design, and it's when they're trying to operationalize it and the attention of the organization has gone elsewhere, and that's where it often gets quite difficult. You talk about the activation phase. So often when the design is done, there's a big snagging list of things that don't fit or whatever once it starts to. How important is that part of it, and what do clients get wrong about it potentially?
I mean, I'm struck by the question because that's where it works or it doesn't. I mean, that to me is, did we just waste 6 months and X amount of money, or are we going to make good on it? And that's, I think, the hardest part too, for both the client and the consultant, because that's when people are like, oh, we've arrived. We did the design. And the answer is, now the hard part begins. That was the easy part. Now we have to live it. And you know what? Frankly, I'm terrified of that phase. That's where it gets really rough. And so do I like passing that on to somebody else? Yes, but I'm challenging myself now in my practice to continue into that. Because I think knowing how the design came to be and having been part of that and having built that trust in those relationships, you can't really pass off the implementation all that well. It's like, okay, my work is done. Now someone else is going to carry you through the rough patches. And there's a little bit of, well, we did this together. And so I'm challenging myself to be in it together with the client.
I was going to say, yeah, an implementation for us, I think when we work with clients, it starts right back at the beginning, doesn't it? The foundations you lay at the beginning, and as you're doing the design and the diagnostic, you're already laying the groundwork for the implementation that's coming.
Well, I think that's where the participatory process comes in. You know, I'm very aware that McKinsey has what I call a cave, and it's where they go and do their designs. And their designs might be flashier and even better than mine, but are they implementable? No, because the client wasn't part of it. It's not grounded in the organization's understanding of itself and their self-concept. So is it a great design, you know, by design logic? Phenomenal. Are their slides wonderful? Absolutely. Can I make sense of it and then go implement it? No, and I've been asked to do that. I've been given a 100-page McKinsey deck on strategy implementation from a design point of view and been like, can you help me make sense of this and figure this out? And I'm like, there are a couple of things here that I think resonate with your organization, but I'm not sure it all does. And then we start from scratch and they're like, oh, this is actually fitting. But it's a lot more work than it was with McKinsey. And I say, and then A year later, they call back and they say, we're using it. We're just starting to use it even a year later. But, now we're ready and now we can do it. And that to me was the best work I ever did at Accenture was that refresh, because they were involved. And so they're I'm not even there to stand it up. I think a couple of colleagues are there doing a couple other small designs, but the big strategy design work, the real operating model translation is being stood up by them.
I was just going to say, I guess it's one of the frustrations of the type of work that we do, that sometimes an organization has to go through that kind of McKinsey experience where they've gone for the thing that looks like it's going to do the job and it's going to be straightforward and simple, and have it not work. And then that's when we can go in and do the work that we want to do and the work that, kind of really works for the organization. It's, is there a way of short-circuiting that process so people don't go through the pain of a failed approach?
Danny, you're doing it. This podcast is it. You're getting the word out. I mean, what the two of you are doing is sharing how we do this work. And I think if people call you and say, I liked what I watched, I liked what I read, I liked going to that event that you put together, then there's already an entry point. And maybe they're saying, I like it better than the McKinsey work I did already. Or maybe they're saying, this just resonates with me. And then they don't start with the other one. But I would say what you do, what I do to forward the field, it's in some ways it's marketing. And marketing is, I think, a form of generosity in our field. Like the time it takes you to put together this podcast, the time it takes you to host these events, the energy behind it is a form of generosity to practitioners, to clients, to, you're really helping people. And I think that's where the dedication to craft comes in, that we believe so clearly in what we do, why we do it, and how we do it. And there's a set of principles, there are values behind it, there is an understanding of the process, there's theory of 80 years here that we can really rest on. And that is what makes it different.
There's so much writing you've done that we've just really enjoyed, but there was one particular one that stood out for me that I'm allowed one question that I really want to ask each session. So this is my question. So I can never pronounce this, the Zeigarnik effect, where basically people have a greater memory for unfinished tasks rather than the completed ones. Is that a phenomenon that you see in organizations, and why is it such a prevalent thing?
Yeah, so this is early Gestalt research that is out of the Berlin Institute of Psychology, when Kurt Lewin in the 20s and early 30s, very early 30s, so mostly the 20s, I think this was like 1927, was teaching their graduate students. And most of his graduate students were international. So he had a couple Japanese, a couple Russian, and Olga Zeigarnik was one of the Russian women who he was teaching. And he would take them every week to a cafe. And they would sit for hours and hours in one of these wonderful Berlin cafes with all the delicious coffee and cakes. And they would order rounds and rounds of coffee and cakes and talk about their research. And it was kind of an informal salon setting, which he continued at the University of Iowa when he came to the US. I think the coffee and cake were probably less good, but he did that. And Olga was talking about memory as a tension system, that there's something there that holds it and releases it. And Kurt Lewin thought, I wonder about these waiters, because they can hold our individual orders and give separate checks after 5 hours of us sitting here to the item per person by memory. I wonder what would happen if we asked them to repeat it after we've paid the bill. And so they paid their bills, and 10 minutes later, they said, could you tally that up again? And the waiter was incredibly offended. How could you ask me to do that? Of course I don't remember. And it was just this assumption that I remember when I need to and I don't when I don't. And that's when they then took it to the lab and did the research to say that actually memory is a tension system, and that an unfinished business, an unclosed cycle of experience will stay in memory, which is really the foundation for Gestalt therapy, that it's about closing those cycles of experience from the past that haven't been closed and doing it in the present. So this idea of closing a cycle of experience as ending memory, or putting memory from front of mind to back of mind, I think it really sits in organizations, because organizations can get stuck on something that happened and trauma points. And I see this a lot, especially in nonprofits that lose funding. And we do the future search timeline with every client. And it's like, where are the trauma points that you're stuck in? Where are the points that are the unfinished business that haven't been closed? Where are you still remembering every coffee and cake that was ordered in 2014? and therefore aren't paying attention to 2024.
It's so true, isn't it? Because you go through change and all of the previous traumas often come up, don't they? And people with sort of the longer term memories can often they have to process it almost, isn't it? There's often a lot of hurt in organizations that is actually unprocessed.
And sometimes naming it is enough, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes bringing it to awareness is like, oh, now we can let it go. And sometimes it's, okay, now we have to unpack it, which is why I think it's so hard to contract for this work. Because if you say, well, we're going to do the organization design in 3 months and everything, and then you hit one of these trauma snags in the very beginning of the design process, and you think, well, we have to process this in order to get to the design, how do you then recontract? And that's a question I'm wrestling with.
If you look back at all the work you've done so far, what would you say the biggest lessons that you've learned so far in your OD career and work are?
This is a lesson I'm learning now, which is it's important to know what you know, and it's important to know what you don't know. And I am on the cusp of knowing more. And the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And that is a very, very humbling experience. So the process I'm in now is how to not know without losing confidence in what I do know. And that is an energetic experience. It's a use of energy with clients. How do you lean in where you know and say, when you don't know, I have someone, or I have a colleague, or let me find out, or let me ask, or this is just not something that I'm well versed in. Because to pretend you know when you don't in a field of helping is malpractice. But when you get to know a little bit, you get very excited and you think you know a lot, or at least I did. So I'll speak for myself. When you get good at something, you think you're good at. I thought I was pretty good at everything, and found out that maybe I'm good at the thing I was good at, and I need to double down on that, but also be aware of all the things that I need to learn still. And seeing this as an ongoing experience, as we were talking about earlier, about the act of perfecting being the perfection itself, rather than actually getting there, is really the learning here.
And learning is lifelong, isn't it, for all of us in this profession, I think. So what does your own learning and development look like now? How are you investing in yourself and building that knowledge or skills or capability or whatever that is?
I've been longing to go to Rothie Park for a long time. And so planning to do the Human Systems Dynamics certification program in December there. I did that before I took my master's in OD. That was the first OD learning I did after the Authentic Leadership in Action Institute. I went to Fort Worth, Texas with Glenda and Royce and Griff and a bunch of others, and learned Human Systems Dynamics. And then I think I used the principles, but I've forgotten all of the content. And it's been 11 years now. So I'm thinking, I actually, instead of progressing, want to go back, because that was so fundamental. But I know so much more now about the field and how it can be used that I think I will understand it very differently. Plus, a trip to Rothie Park would be lovely.
Because I enjoy it. I've been to Rothie Park a couple of times, and it's one of my favourite places.
Yeah, and we've got Dr. Graham Curtis going to be joining us in a few weeks' time, isn't he?
He is, yeah.
Who runs the masters there as well. So that's going to be really interesting. And then final question, because you've got such an interesting career. We were absolutely compelled when you were sharing your journey. We're trying to inspire the next generation of OD&D practitioners, whether you're internal, external, whether you're practicing it full-time or whether you're practicing it as an element of your role. What advice would you give to someone who's starting out or just at the very early stages in their career in OD now?
Be a lot more patient than I was. That's the fundamental advice. I think what we're doing in our respective circles is trying to lower the barrier to entry to a very, very difficult field. If we think about how this field grew in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there weren't many master's programs, but there were a lot of good people doing good work who you could apprentice with, really with no understanding at all of the field. You met them, they liked you, and all of a sudden you had a job with a living wage doing the work, and you learned on the job, and you were taught by people who had been there since the beginning, who knew Kurt Lewis. And that doesn't exist in the way it used to. We went in, we kind of swung as a field into really codifying this into master's programs. And at least in the United States now, a lot of those master's programs, we're losing a lot of that. So there's this huge gap where I'm thinking that apprenticeship needs to come back, or we need a new model. So I would say the best way to grow in this field is to learn from someone who's doing the work, and is to do the work as much as you can. It's a field where the unfortunate saying is you need experience to get experience. And so the way to get experience is to try it out. My first OD gig was calling my university and saying, I'm trying this out. Would you like it for one of some of your student groups? And they said, sure. And I think it was a total flop. But boy, did I learn and have something under my belt that I could talk about it at my first job interview. So there's a quality of getting out there and doing it that I think, don't wait for permission, but also know that it takes a long time to learn this and that the ways of learning are changing in our field. So I think be patient, be engaged is the best advice I have. I was very impatient. I thought I should be able to do this work without even a master's. And then I started my master's and I thought, what was I thinking?
Julian, I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of Danny and I. I can't speak for Danny, but I've really enjoyed this conversation.
Absolutely.
You've taken our questions and just really answered them with like an openness and a precision that we really appreciated as well. And it's really sort of expanded our thinking, which is exactly why we set out on this journey of podcasts originally. And it's just so refreshing to know exactly, give us a little bit of an insight in terms of what's happening with OD in terms of like large consultancies and also what's happening over in the States as well. And some of the challenges that you're having are quite similar to the ones that we're having here as well. So please keep doing what you're doing and being generous and building your community over there as well. We really appreciate it. Just some of the takeaways that there's so many, but I'm only allowed 3. So 3 primary takeaways for me is trauma snagging. I love it. That is a concept that needs to be talked about a lot more. And the importance of writing to make sense of things, to actually process all the different things that we see consistently. And then also the really powerful part that you were saying, which is, really being very clear and working through the client in terms of how you work and making sure that there's a fit as early on in the process so that you can actually get their informed consent to make sure you can work well together. Danny, how about you? What stands out for you?
So much. Lots of what you said, but I think there's 3 things from me. I think the thing you said near the beginning about being really clear on the problem that we're trying to solve, kind of really digging into that before we start doing any work, because it's critical we understand that before we start. I think the importance of, as a community of OD practitioners, convening, meeting with each other, supporting each other, sharing our learning, continuing those conversations, dialogue, and also that people own what they help create. So the importance of participative involvement from everybody. I could go on for hours because there was loads.
I get to edit this, so I get to replay it again, which is great. Julian, we really want people to follow your work and follow your writing because people will learn a lot from it. What's the best way for people to reach out to you and to follow you?
Yes, please reach out on LinkedIn. I think that's where I'm posting everything now. I don't know what that will look like if I ever decide to put up a one-page website with everything, but as my bibliography grows, LinkedIn is the best place to read and also to write me, because I love having these conversations with as many people as I can. So please do reach out, and would love to meet everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, Julian now joins our growing portfolio of distinguished practitioners that we've met and that sort of shared their practice as well. So if you're watching this, we really do appreciate and hopefully you've earned your like. Feel free to subscribe to the channel, or if you're catching this on audio on one of the platforms that you're listening to as well. Julian, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being so generous as well with it, and just wishing you lots of luck, and keep us posted all the your musings and insights as you go through your journey. Thank you.
Thank you both. This has been lovely.
Thank you.